the song that they just played, Nearer My God to Thee, that was the song that they were playing on the Titanic as it was going down. Nearer my God to Thee. The Titanic was 833 feet long. Its gross tonnage was 46,000 tons. And fully loaded was 53,310 tons. Huge ship. It was 92.5 feet wide, and its draft was 34 feet, which meant that it needed at least 34 feet so that it did not scrape the bottom of the seafloor. That's a big ship. I know Jeannie and I were on the Queen Mary out in Los Angeles over our honeymoon. It was huge. Wow. And the Titanic started its maiden voyage on April the 10th, 1912. And it sank 4 days later on April 14th, 1912. You see, the Titanic was billed to be a ship that's just impossible to sink. And Adam as the head of the human race, was made to be unsinkable if he just obeyed. Edward John Smith. He was the captain of the Titanic. And he reportedly stated that even God himself could not sink the Titanic. One of the passengers overheard Captain Smith say that, and she said, "You know, I could never sleep during the voyage because I felt as though Captain Smith was shaking his fist in the face of God." And I don't know who's beeping. That's not me, is it? Okay. And you need to turn your phone off and turn God on, Michael. And so Edward John Smith was the captain of the Titanic. He was a very well-seasoned captain. For at least 35 years, he had been a captain of the great ships around the world. He was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy and later part of the Royal Navy Reserve, and he captained the largest ships in the world like the Baltic and the Adriatic and the Olympic. And it wasn't even his first transatlantic trip. He'd done this before. This was, okay, we'll just do this again. This is starting to become old hat to him. And he was known as the safe captain. The safe captain. And he gained this huge following among passengers. And some passengers regarded him as being so safe and so trustworthy as that if he wasn't the captain, they didn't want to sail. That's who this guy was. And after a stellar career, this was supposed to be Captain Smith's retirement cruise. And along with all the fanfare of his retirement cruise, he wanted to set a new speed record across the Atlantic to New York. And the Titanic cruised at 26.6 miles per hour, or 23.5 knots. And there were several factors that came into play. The first factor was speed. You know, Titanic was traveling about 26 miles an hour when it hit the iceberg, and it's not really that fast unless you consider a fully loaded ship that weighed a little over 106,000 pounds. How many times have you seen a locomotive hit the brakes and slide to a screeching halt in just a few feet? It doesn't happen. And it didn't happen with this ship either. And the second factor in play was a thing called Morse code. Now, Morse code was invented along with the telegraph in the 1830s and the 1840s by Samuel Morse. It just revolutionized long-distance communication. I mean, this was high tech in its day. But there were drawbacks to Morse code. Morse code, each letter had to be sent. And wires needed to be connected to both the sending and the receiving operator, who could also decipher or hear what the Morse code was. It wasn't anything verbal. But this was great. And then Marconi invented something called the radio in 1896. But at that time, the radio also used Morse code. But it was state of the art. It was wireless. Nobody could even fathom, wow, how can you send Morse code way over there and there's no wires? It's the cell phone of today, back then. And that was just, wow. Talk about cutting edge, state of the art. And that was being used on the Titanic, and that made everybody feel safer. But because it used Morse code, it was very time consuming. And that's why sending the many messages just absolutely swamped Titanic's radio operator on that fateful night. Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone on March 7th, 1876, but it also needed wires to connect. So it was totally unavailable to the Titanic. Now, there were reports of icebergs in the area when Titanic was sailing, so it was not a surprise. The radio of the Titanic was busy. Busy with what? Well, they were sending all these messages of, I'm on the Titanic tonight, look at me, or checking their business or their stocks and bonds. They were busy. They wanted everybody to know that they were on the Titanic because this was the place to be. So the radio operator was so busy sending all these greetings and messages and checking on stocks and everything that when the other ships tried to warn them of the danger, sometimes they got what we call busy signal. There were reports of iceberg warnings in the area, and they got a busy signal. Now, Matthew chapter 24, verse 38 says, "For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage." They were busy. Is there anything wrong with being busy? No. Adam and Eve were also given messages of warning. Warning about the deceiver who was about to try them. And Satan was attempting for the first time to do what he has so successfully done in our time, and that's to divide and conquer. Isn't that the way it works? Whether it's politics or race or income or social status, just divide and conquer and they'll fall like bowling pins. Well, Satan was attempting to divide and conquer the two sinless inhabitants that God placed on this earth, Adam and Eve. And I would like to read a quote from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, page 39. Great little book. When Adam and Eve were placed in the beautiful garden, they had everything for their happiness which they could desire. But He, God, chose in His all-wise arrangement to test their loyalty before they could be rendered eternally secure. They were to have His favor, and He to converse with them, and they with Him. Yet He did not place evil out of their reach, and Satan was permitted to tempt them. If they endured the trial, they were to be in perpetual favor with God and the heavenly angels. What a deal! What a deal! Did God give them a tough test? Anything hard? Easiest test He could for loyalty. Who will you obey? Who do you serve? Continuing on with the quote. Listen carefully. Angels of God visited Adam and Eve and told them of the fall of Satan and warned them to be on their guard. They cautioned them not to separate from each other. Not to what? Not to separate from each other in their employment, for they might be brought in contact with this fallen foe. If one of them were alone, they would be in greater danger than if both were together. The angels enjoined upon them to closely follow the instructions God had given them, for in perfect obedience they were safe. They were safe. And this fallen foe would then have no power to deceive them. God would not permit Satan to follow the holy pair with continual temptations. That's not what happened. He, or Satan, could only have access to them at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, page 39. As I read this, I realize that they began to set up, they began to invite, if you will, their disobedience just by simply separating from each other, weren't they? Didn't the angel tell them, do not separate yourselves, stay together in unity where there's strength? And like you have this bond of love between you, you don't want to break the bond of love between you and God. But like Captain Smith, Adam was the captain of the human race, but Adam should not have permitted himself to be separated from Eve's side. They both knew that the evil one was going to try to tempt them to sin. I'd like to read another quote from the book Mind, Character, and Personality, Volume 2, page 566. Under God, it starts out, Adam was to stand at the head of the earthly family, to maintain the principles of the heavenly family. This would have brought peace and happiness, but the law that none liveth to himself, Romans 14:7, Satan was determined to oppose. He desired to live for self. He sought to make himself a center of influence. It was this that had incited rebellion in heaven, and it was man's acceptance of this principle that brought sin on earth. When Adam sinned, man broke away from the heaven-ordained center. A demon became the central power in the world. where God's throne should have been, Satan placed his throne. The world laid homage to a willing offering at the feet of the enemy. Mind, Character, and Personality, Volume 2, page 566. Now I'd like to read Job chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Job chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. And came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord. You can hear the arrogance in his voice. You can almost picture the hand on his hip. Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. God knew where Satan was, but where have you been, Satan? Now, the phrase sons of God, as used in this verse, is interesting. Since sin has been quarantined to planet Earth, these had to have been the representatives of the unfallen worlds, correct? One from each world. Adam was to be the representative of our world, but when he fell to Satan's temptations, Satan felt that he had become ruler of this world and thereby the rightful representative of our world. That's why he showed up. Satan was saying to God, I belong here. I've conquered Adam. And back in the garden, like the Titanic, Eve hit her iceberg when she hesitated, when she stopped and looked and wondered, and she toyed with the idea of accepting this fruit and trying to weigh the option until disobedience didn't seem to be that bad of a deal, and she disobeyed God. When Satan succeeded in tempting Eve, Eve became the iceberg that he sent to Adam. Do you realize that? He separated him. He said, I've got a great idea. If I can get one of them to fall, to use against the other one, oh, that's going to work. Just happened to be Eve that fell first. She was the iceberg that Satan sent to Adam. And when Adam, the captain of the human race, chose Eve over God, he hit the iceberg that it will allow a flood of sin into his life and the entire human race as well. Romans 5:12 says, Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Jesus Christ is the captain of our salvation. He's a light of God's love, justice, and mercy. Acts 4:12 says, Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Now let's go back to the Titanic, the day of the tragedy. It was a beautiful, clear day. Everybody was just enjoying the cruise, and they just felt so safe with the safe captain, Captain Smith. At 9:40 p.m., the ship Masaba. The ship Masaba sent Titanic a message about an ice field that includes heavy packed ice and a great number of large icebergs. And what a lot of people don't realize, do you realize that 85 to 90% of an iceberg is underwater? You only see just the tip of the iceberg, as they say. 85 to 90% of the iceberg, you've got this mammoth, huge iceberg just coming out in a pyramid shape, and you only see this tip. This message never reached Titanic's bridge because the radio operator Jack Phillips was busy with passengers' messages. It's quite furious. I mean, just, if you've ever tried to decipher Morse code, it's not easy. That was at 9:40, so at 10 o'clock, there was a shift change on the bridge, and lookouts began their watch in the crow's nest, and the night is unusually calm. Just a beautiful evening. But you see, that makes icebergs harder to see, because when the waves hit on the icebergs, it glows around the base, and you can see them better, especially on a moonlit night. But it was a beautiful night, unusually calm, so it was going to make it tougher. And then the third factor at play, loss of sight. Adding to the difficulty of a beautiful night, the binoculars in the crow's nest were misplaced. You seen them? No, I haven't seen them. Well, so-and-so had, well, I didn't have them. Nobody had the binoculars. Maybe they're up on the bridge, I don't know. But there are no binoculars in the crow's nest. And likewise, just like they lost sight in the crow's nest, Adam had lost sight when it came to Eve, and she stood in front of him holding the forbidden fruit and offering it to him and saying, "Why? It's okay, it's okay. Look at me, I'm fine." We're even told that she felt a new resilience as it was going through her body. She looked as beautiful as before. And Adam chose. Adam chose to share Eve's fate, whatever it may be. He chose Eve over God. In the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 56, interesting quote. It says, "An expression of sadness came over the face of Adam. He appeared astonished and alarmed. Adam understood. He understood that his companion had transgressed the commandment of God. There was a terrible struggle in his mind. Terrible. He resolved to share her fate. If she must die, he would die with her." Patriarchs and Prophets, page 56. What a struggle, I'm sure it was. At 10:55, the nearby ship, the Californian, radios the Titanic. "Say, old man," this is the quote, "we are stopped and surrounded by ice." They had stopped. The Californian had stopped. "We're surrounded by ice." And an annoyed radio operator, Jack Phillips, responded to him. "Shut up. shut up, shut up. Can't you see that I'm busy? Wow. Didn't basically Adam tell God, shut up, can't you see that I'm busy? Hebrews 3:15 says, while it is today, if you will hear his voice, if you will hear Jesus' voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. Now, a good definition for the word provocation is it's an action or a speech that makes someone annoyed or angry, especially when it's done deliberately. Did Jack Phillips upset the other person? Yeah, he did. Do we upset God? Yeah, we do when we say that. How many times can we tell God to go away like the radio operator did? Is there anything wrong with being busy? No. We hear idle hands are the devil's workshop. But are you busy doing God's work or your own? Can you be too busy doing God's work? How about this voice? It says, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in which all the graves shall hear his voice. Do you want to hear God's voice at the resurrection? I hope so. I do. And if you want to hear God's voice, then you need to hear his voice right now, don't you? If you don't hear his voice now, you're not going to hear it then. And there won't be any mistake as to what resurrection you are brought up in when it happens. You won't have to wonder if you're saved or lost. It'll be quite evident. Now at 11 p.m., most of Titanic's passengers had just retired in their rooms for the night. It's late. You know, we've danced, we've had lots of good food, and we've laughed and had good conversations, and this is just so great to be on this ship. At 11:35, the wireless operator on the ship, the Californian, which was told to shut up, was supposed to stay on the radio until midnight. But it was a beautiful, calm evening, and his feelings were hurt. So at 11:35, he turned off his radio about 5 minutes before the Titanic hit the iceberg. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet sees an enormous iceberg in Titanic's path. And he rings the bell 3 times to indicate that something's ahead. He then calls the bridge, and First Officer Murdoch, he hesitates, and then he orders the Titanic hard to starboard or to the left, reverse the engines, and close the watertight doors. That was a bad choice by the second in command. The captain should have been on the bridge then during the most dangerous time of the voyage when it was dark and icy. A subordinate made the call while he spent time with the wealthy passengers. And like Captain Smith, Adam felt that all was safe. I mean, here we are, we're in the garden, and it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's perfect, and everything is safe, and he underestimated the devil. And by turning the Titanic hard to starboard and reversing the props, it actually shoved the port side of the ship into the iceberg. And had Captain Smith been on the bridge at that moment, it's probable that a different order would have been given, but it's too late. It's already done. Had Captain Smith become soft and complacent in his command through his experience over the years? Which I have to ask, have we all become soft and complacent through the hearing of the word? Are we not perceiving the urgency of our time? You know, we've heard this gospel so many times, and it's like the captain, I've crossed the Atlantic so many times, they've got it, I don't need to be there. At 11:40, the port side of the Titanic scrapes along the iceberg. Captain Smith scrambles to arrive upon the deck, and he's told that the ship has already hit an iceberg, just like Adam has already realized that Eve had taken the forbidden fruit. Shortly thereafter, he's informed that the mailroom is filling with water. And it's only natural for water to flow into an open cavity, just like sin wants to flow into us. Luke chapter 12, verse 1 says that he, Jesus, began to say unto his disciples, first of all, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. What is our leaven today? Acts of the Apostles, page 307, says, he, Paul, knew that at every step in the Christian pathway, they would be opposed by the synagogue of Satan, and that they would have to engage in conflicts daily. They would have to guard against the stealthy approach of the enemy, forcing back old habits and natural inclinations, and ever watching unto prayer. Ever watching unto prayer. Should not have Captain Smith guarded the very approach of danger and thereby disaster? He should have been on the bridge at the most dangerous time of the voyage. He knew, he understood, just like Adam knew and he understood, and he should have been with Eve. Other reports soon came in with water in at least 5 compartments of the Titanic. The designer and engineer rushed to the bridge. They did some calculations, and they said, Captain, Titanic will go down in about 2.5 hours. Because Titanic was only designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments, not 5. And of the 4 watertight compartments, they did not go all the way to the ceiling. And so, as the first compartment filled and the second, the ship started to tilt, and the water would flow over the top of that compartment to the next and to the next to the next, until you've got a ship like this that literally broke in two. The odd thing is they waited an entire hour before sending up a flare. Isn't that how we do when we are in denial for something that we've done, a sinful act? We're in denial. We don't want to send up a flare. They waited an entire hour before they sent up a flare for help. One ship in the distance saw that they were sending up a flare, but the flare that they sent up meant celebration rather than distress. They sent up the wrong flare. The Titanic wasn't completely unprepared for disaster when she sank. She was just woefully unprepared. We all know that the ship didn't have enough lifeboats and loaded them inefficiently, about 40% of capacity at the beginning. But what is less known is that the Titanic flare guns, when they fired the white, that meant celebration. Red was and still is the emergency standard. You didn't fire the red flare. So when the Titanic was sinking, her crew fired the flare guns, but the wrong flares. And the Californian and the other ships saw the white flares, but didn't consider them a distress call from the White Star Line. They were sending the white flares. We're celebrating. We're on the Titanic. No, you're going down. At one point, the Californian, commanded by Captain Lord, of all names, may have been as close as 6 miles to the stricken vessel, but like Adam, they sensed no danger. They're using the white flare. And so turning hard to starboard and reversing the props, what it didn't actually allow the ship to turn hard to the left. If they would have left the props going forward and turned hard to the left, it would have allowed the ship to do what it does, is turn hard to the left. But they didn't do that. And the Titanic possibly maybe would not have sunk if they would have simply reversed the props and hit the iceberg head on. We've been told by Mrs. White we need to meet sin head on. In the book Selected Messages, Book 1, page 206, it says, meet it. An iceberg, meet it. Page 206. Mrs. White says, shortly before I sent out the testimonies regarding the efforts of the enemy to undermine the foundation of our faith through the dissemination of seductive theories, I had read an incident about a ship in a fog meeting an iceberg. One night, a scene was clearly presented before me. A vessel was upon the waters in a heavy fog. Suddenly, the lookout cried, "Iceberg just ahead." There, towering high above the ship, was a gigantic iceberg. An authoritative voice cried out, "Meet it! Meet it!" And there was not a moment's hesitation. It was a time for instant action. The engineer put on full steam, and the man at the wheel steered at the ship straight into the iceberg. With a crash, she struck the ice. There was a fearful shock, and the iceberg broke into many pieces, falling with a noise like thunder to the deck. The passengers were violently shaken by the force of the collisions, but no lives were lost. The vessel was injured, but not beyond repair. She rebounded from the contact, trembling from stem to stern like a living creature. Then she moved forward on her way. I heard the words like the voice from our captain, speaking of Jesus, "Meet it." I knew what my duty was, and that there was not a moment to lose. The time for decided action had come. I must, without delay, obey the command and meet it. Another quote from the Great Controversy, pages 506 and 507. It says, "Sin is not to them repulsive and abhorrent as it was to their master. They do not meet it as Christ did, with decisive and determined resistance. They do not realize the exceeding evil and malignity of sin, and they are blinded both to the character and the power of the Prince of Darkness. There is little enmity against Satan and his works, because there is so great ignorance concerning his power and malice, and the vast extent of his warfare against Christ and his church. Multitudes are deluded here. They do not know that their enemy is a mighty general who controls the minds of evil angels, and that with well-matured plans and skillful movements, he is warring against Christ to prevent the salvation of their souls. She calls Satan a general with well-laid plans. And I want to re-emphasize the first part of what I read from Selected Messages, Book 1, page 206. Shortly before I sent out the testimonies, the 9 volumes, regarding the efforts of our enemy to undermine the foundation of our faith through the dissemination of seductive theories, I had read an incident about a ship in a fog meeting an iceberg. And one night, a scene was clearly presented before me, a vessel upon the waters in a heavy fog, and suddenly the lookout cried, "Iceberg ahead!" And there, towering above the ship, was a gigantic iceberg, and an authoritative cry went out, "Meet it! Meet it!" What would have happened if Adam, as captain of the human race, Adam was the captain of the human race, what would have happened if he would have met Sid head on and not taken the forbidden fruit that Eve offered? And I'm not sure. Yes, it's hard to meet sin head on, but it's always for our best good. Now, when they first hit the iceberg, Captain Smith did not want to panic. So a so-called preliminary drill was suggested to the passengers. And the crew went about the ship very politely, knocking on passengers' doors. Excuse me, sir, I know that it's late, I know, but we've had an issue, we've had a bit of a problem, and the captain wants everybody on deck on this cold night with icebergs around. And I'm sure probably the standard reply was, "Oh, okay," and then he went back to bed. But you have to remember, it's like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, as they're politely knocking on the doors of the passengers. And therefore, several of the lifeboats were below half capacity when they launched, because, oh, this is the Titanic, it's not going to go down. This is the Garden of Eden. We're sinless. Less than half capacity as they launched out into the deep. Titanic did not have enough lifeboats for everybody, so later on, the order was given, women and children first. First sign that your ship is going down. That's the order that was given, and it was obeyed. And I just wonder, in today's pitiful society that we find ourselves in, would we recognize women and children first if we were on the ship? Well, I'm important because, and I'm important because, and I'm important because. Titanic was full of millionaires, which today would be billionaires or trillionaires. The average income back in 1912 was $1,033 a year. A year. Isidor Straus, one of the many millionaires on board. He was the co-owner with his brother of Macy's, and he's also a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was aboard with his wife, Ida. And remember, women and children first. And it became more evident that Titanic's gone down, Titanic's gone down. And there was more of a fever to get into the lifeboats. Of course, they knew that Ida standing there with her husband, who she was, and the wealth and the influence. They offered Ida a seat in the lifeboat. You know what she did? She took off her mink stole, gave it to her maid, and gave her maid her seat on the lifeboat. She said, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived together these many years, so will we die together." Wow. They reportedly were hugging when the ship went down, the eyewitnesses said. She gave her spot to her maid. She could have said, "Well, he's going to die and I'm just going to be fat and wealthy and all this, and you're just a maid." Is that what she said? No. And trust me, I know the character of my wonderful wife of 44 years. She really is something. And I believe that she would say the same thing if we were under those conditions. Wouldn't you, Jeannie? Probably. Pastor John Harper, unlike the crew politely knocking on the doors, he frantically went about the ship before it went down, asking everyone, "Are you saved, brother? Are you saved, sister?" Acts 16:31 says, "Believe on the Lord Jesus, and thou shalt be saved." Yesterday we had the funeral for our beloved brother Marvin Richards. And I can see Marvin doing the same thing, can't you? Doesn't that sound like Marvin? Just going around trying to help people and save them? Isn't that Marvin Richards? It is. Years later, in Canada, they were talking about John Harper gone down with the ship. And there was an old Scotsman in the congregation. And he said, "Pardon me, sir," he said, "but you don't have the story exactly right on John Harper's demise." He said, "Well, how do you know?" He said, "I was on the Titanic." He said, "Would you like to hear what really happened?" He said, "Come on up, brother." So the old Scotsman went to the front of the church. And he said, "I was not a Christian man at all. I was at the bar when we hit the iceberg. I found out we were going down, and I liquored myself up real good. And later on, when I did go to the water," he said, "you would think that it would be terrible, terrible freezing." He said, "Actually, it was the opposite effect." He said, "It was like you were on fire. The water was so cold." And as I'm bobbing in the ocean, a wave brings somebody over to me that's also bobbing, and it's Pastor John Harper. And he said, "Are you saved, brother?" The old Scotsman said, "I don't know." He said, then another wave came up and separated him, out of sight. He said another little swell brought them back together. And John Harper said again, "Are you saved, brother?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus and thou shalt be saved." And another swell separated him, and Pastor Harper drowned. He said, "I made up my mind right then and there." He said, I'm in like 13 or 14,000 feet of water. And he said, I gave my life to the Lord and I've never turned back. So I was Pastor John Harper's last convert. Sin is like an iceberg. It's deadly and it sleeps below the surface, where you don't see the tremendous results of what you're going to say or do. And just like the iceberg tore into the side of this mighty ship, sin tears into our sides and sinks us spiritually. A cherished sin is like the chilling water that rushes into your very being. And like freezing water, it expands into your thoughts and controls your actions like the rudder on a ship. And as the cold water of death is flooding in and your ship is going down, your only hope is like when Peter cried out, Lord, save me, while they were on the sea. As the Titanic sank, it broke in half. If sin is unconfessed and unforsaken, it'll break you in half as well, as the chill of death falls upon you because you have not surrendered your life to Christ. It's just real simple. And so, will you go down into the cold, deep darkness of eternal death? Or will you get into the lifeboat that Jesus has provided for you? Proverbs 6:27 says, can a man take fire into his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Is that even possible? But you see, this scripture not only applies to the actual clothes that a person is wearing, but it's also talking about the spotless robe of Christ that a Christian wears. Can you take sin into your life? Can you take fire into your life and not burn your spotless robe that Christ has provided for you? It's not possible. Can you play with known sin? Captain Smith was making his final voyage before retiring. Adam's retirement, if you will, if you want to put it that way, Adam's retirement basically was based on perfect obedience to God and receiving eternal life and happiness. Wasn't that his final voyage in this earth that could go either way? There were about 15 mechanics. No, let me back up. A lot of people built the Titanic, and they had a bit of a lottery, a drawing of names, and there was about 15 mechanics that got their names drawn, that got to go on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. They gave them free passage, free food, free everything, and all the town was a buzz about it. Oh, they were excited. But you see, they all perished. And they were all pretty much from the same town and pretty much went to the same church. Can you imagine the grief in this town? The devastation. There are reports of men walking along, seeing each other on the street, shake hands, hug, and cry, and walk away without saying a word because the grief was so deep they couldn't even speak. And funny enough, an American pastor had already been scheduled to arrive at this church and speak. If you're the pastor, wow, what are you going to speak about? How do you address this? Matthew 8:23 says, and when Jesus was entered into the ship, his disciples followed him. And I've got to tell you that the only unsinkable ship that ever sailed was the one that Jesus was in. And this American pastor, you know what the title of his sermon was? The Unsinkable Ship. It wasn't as in, you thought it was unsinkable. No. It was the only unsinkable ship that ever sailed was the one that had Jesus in it. It was splintery. It wasn't like the Titanic. It was splintery. It was covered with barnacles. It had water in it. But no matter how violent the storm was, there was complete safety because Jesus was there. Jesus is the ultimate captain, and he's asking you to get into the lifeboat. If you have not chosen to get into the lifeboat with Jesus, you need to. He's offering all of humanity a life preserver that can never fail. Now, the life preservers on the Titanic, there were these great big bulky pieces of cork covered with, very unflattering material. And you had the people coming up to the rich in their wonderful evening gowns and their tuxedos. Pardon me, sir, would you put these clunky life preservers on so that you don't die? Why would I put those on? Get away. Can't you see I'm in my tuxedo? She's in her evening gown and everything, and they're playing the music. Well, sir, you need to leave the nice warm ship and get into the little dinghy and push off as far as you can out into the cold, dark ocean. You can imagine how they felt. Sometimes we need to leave our nice, warm, comfy situation and push out as well. Jesus Christ, the captain that is always on the bridge. He's always at the helm during any storm in our lives. Any and all storms, he's there. And Jesus is the captain that's never surprised. You'll never surprise him. And Jesus is the captain that never makes a mistake. And Jesus is the captain that did not trust our salvation to a second in command, did he? He came himself. What a God we serve. And Jesus is the captain that always meets it head on. Jesus is also the captain that makes sure that there's room in his unsinkable boat, unsinkable ship for you, for me, for all of humanity. Won't you get in and be saved, please?